If you live in Canada and you have been half watching the news out of the corner of your eye, you already know the number. August 19th. That is the date circled in red on the calendars of trade officials in Ottawa and Washington. The date that has automakers, dairy farmers, wine and spirit sellers, and cabinet ministers all bracing for what comes next. And as of right now, with just days to go, nobody on either side of the border can tell you with certainty how this ends. Before we start the video, subscribe to Capital Current now. Here is where things actually stand. Back in July, President Donald Trump signed a set of proclamations invoking a section of American trade law that most Canadians had never heard of before this year, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. What it does, in plain terms, is give the president the power to slap tariffs on a country he believes is treating American exports unfairly. And in this case, the administration decided that Canada fit that description, pointing to dairy, alcohol, and the auto sector as the three areas where it says Canadian policy discriminates against American products. The result was a threat of 50% tariffs on a wide slice of Canadian goods, everything from hockey sticks to cement to wine, set to take effect on August 19th. And here is the detail that has trade lawyers and business owners across the country genuinely rattled, unlike most of the tariffs we have seen over the past year and a half. These ones would not come with the usual exemption for goods that already comply with the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the trade deal we all know as SUSMA. In other words, this is not just another round of the same fight. This is designed to hit even the goods that were supposed to be protected. So what happens now with the clock running down? Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, has been living out of a suitcase in Washington for weeks at this point. He has met repeatedly with the United States Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, alongside Canada's chief negotiator, Janice Charette. By the middle of August, those meetings had become almost a daily rhythm, both sides trying to hammer out something, anything, that could be presented to the president before the deadline arrives. And there has been movement. Reports this past week describe negotiators circling around a possible framework, one where Canada would offer concessions on things like its retaliatory tariffs on American autos, the provincial restrictions that pulled American alcohol off liquor store shelves last year, and a reworking of how dairy quotas are structured. In exchange, the ask is that Washington agrees to shelve the new 50% tariffs entirely and ease up on the sectoral tariffs already sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, and forest products. That is the shape of the deal that has reportedly been floated. Whether it actually gets signed is a different question entirely, because here is the honest picture, and it is worth saying plainly rather than pretending this is already settled. As of this weekend, the two sides are still described by people close to the talks as far apart. Not close, not nearly there, far apart. Canada's own chief negotiator told a government advisory group over the weekend that there remains, in her words, a significant amount of work left to do. That is diplomatic language for exactly what it sounds like. This thing could genuinely fall apart before Wednesday. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been walking a careful line through all of this. And if you understand Canadian politics even a little, you will understand why. He came into office promising a tougher, more assertive posture toward Washington than what came before, and he has largely delivered on that promise, matching American tariffs with retaliatory measures of Canada's own over the past year. But now he is under pressure from two directions at once. On one side, there is real economic pain building for exporters, for auto workers, for anyone whose business depends on smooth trade across that border. On the other side, there is a domestic political reality where caving to Washington or being seen to cave carries its own steep cost. Carney has said it directly and repeatedly. Canada will not accept a bad deal. That is not just a talking point. It reflects genuine red lines that Ottawa has drawn and does not appear willing to cross, no matter how close the deadline gets. One of those red lines runs straight through the dairy sector, and this is where the politics get particularly complicated, because it is not just a federal issue, it is a provincial one too. Quebec's premier has been especially vocal, calling the preservation of Canada's supply management system for dairy a line that must not be crossed, full stop. Supply management has been a fixture of Canadian agricultural policy for decades, protecting dairy farmers from the kind of price volatility that comes with a fully open market. And it has survived multiple rounds of trade negotiations already, including the original talks that produced SUSMA in the first place. Washington has wanted it gone, or at least significantly weakened, for years. Every time it comes up, Canadian negotiators have found a way to protect it, and every indication right now is that they intend to do the same this time, even if it means walking away without a deal. Alcohol is the other flashpoint, and it is one that Canadians have actually felt directly in liquor stores across the country. When this trade dispute escalated last year, provincial liquor boards, the LCBO in Ontario among them, pulled American wine and spirits off the shelves entirely as part of Canada's retaliatory response. It was a visible, tangible move, the kind of thing an ordinary shopper notices immediately, unlike a tariff line buried in a customs filing. American officials have pointed to that decision specifically as evidence of what they call unjustified retaliation, with the U.S. Trade Representative going as far as comparing Canada's actions to the kind of trade behavior associated with China. That comment did not go over well in Ottawa, and it is a reminder of just how personal and pointed this dispute has become, well beyond the usual bureaucratic language of tariff schedules and trade deficits. Now, step back for a second and think about the scale of what is actually at stake here, because the numbers involved are genuinely enormous. Canada and the United States did close to $900 billion in trade with each other last year. $900 billion. These are, by a wide margin, each other's most important trading partners, with supply chains, particularly in the auto industry, that are woven together so tightly that a single vehicle can cross the border multiple times during production before it is ever finished. A 50% tariff landing on that kind of integrated system does not just hurt one side. It threatens to make everyone's costs go up, everyone's margins shrink, and everyone's planning that much harder. The immediate dollar figure attached to these specific new tariffs is roughly $20 billion in annual Canadian exports, covering goods across the dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicle sectors specifically, along with a broader list that reportedly touches things as varied as cement and hockey sticks. $20 billion is a smaller slice of that overall $900 billion relationship, but it lands concentrated in specific industries and specific communities. The kind of communities where a major tariff hit does not show up as an abstract economic statistic. It shows up as layoffs, as delayed investment, as a plant that quietly cuts a shift. There is also a bigger structural shift happening underneath all of this that deserves attention, because it changes the stakes of every individual negotiation going forward. Back in July, the American administration made clear it would not extend CUSMA for another full term the way many expected. Instead, the agreement is now on a rolling annual review, running for a decade, after which it expires entirely unless all three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, agree to keep it going. That is a meaningful change. It means the guardrails that have governed North American trade for years, the framework everyone has relied on to settle exactly these kinds of disputes, are themselves now less stable and less permanent than they used to be. Every tariff fight from here forward happens against that more uncertain backdrop. So where does that leave things heading into Wednesday? Negotiators on both sides have reportedly been aiming to present a possible path forward to President Trump as early as Monday, giving him the weekend and the start of the week to review whatever framework the two negotiating teams can put together. But it is worth being very clear about what that actually means. Presenting a possible path is not the same thing as reaching an agreement. And even if Trump receives a proposed framework, he still has to decide whether to accept it, whether to send negotiators back to the table for more, or whether to simply let the tariffs proceed as scheduled on August 19th, regardless of where the talks stand. Nobody outside that room knows which of those outcomes is most likely, and anyone telling you with confidence that they do know is guessing. For Canadian businesses, the smart move right now is not to wait and see. Companies that import or export goods potentially covered by these tariffs are being urged to review exactly which of their products fall under the affected classifications, to assess what their actual duty exposure would look like if the 50% rate goes into effect, and to think seriously about inventory timing, about whether shipments can be adjusted, about sourcing alternatives if this drags on. Trade lawyers who work this file for a living are telling clients plainly that this is not the moment to assume it will all work out and get sorted later. Plan for the tariffs landing and treat any relief as a bonus rather than a given. And if the deadline passes without a deal, Canada is not expected to simply absorb it quietly. There has been talk in Ottawa of further retaliatory measures if the 50% tariffs actually take effect, potentially including export taxes on Canadian goods heading south, on top of whatever retaliatory tariffs already remain in place from the earlier rounds of this dispute. That would mark a genuine escalation, not a continuation of where things already stand. And it would put even more pressure on a relationship that as recently as 2 years ago was routinely described as one of the most harmonious and nearly tariff-free trading partnerships anywhere in the world. That description feels almost unrecognizable now. It is worth remembering, too, that this is not the first deadline of this kind Canadians have lived through over the past year and a half. There was the 35% tariff threat last summer. There was the fentanyl-related justification that data never really supported, since only a marginal amount of that drug crosses into the United States from the Canadian side of the border. There was the collapse of talks over a Canadian digital services tax. Each time, there has been a deadline, a round of frantic, last-minute negotiating, and an outcome that shifted the goalposts once again, rather than resolving the underlying dispute for good. That pattern is worth keeping in mind as this latest deadline approaches. It does not mean this time will play out the same way. It might not. But it is a reason for healthy skepticism about any headline in either direction, claiming the story is now finished. What makes this round feel different to a lot of people watching closely is the scale of the number attached to it. 50% is not a modest adjustment. It is the kind of tariff rate that can make certain categories of trade simply uneconomical, forcing companies to either eat enormous cost increases themselves or pass them straight along to consumers on both sides of the border. For an integrated industry like automaking, where components often cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line, a tariff at that level does not just add a line item to a spreadsheet. It threatens to break the underlying economic logic that let cross-border manufacturing work as efficiently as it has for decades. So, as Canadians head into this coming week, the honest summary is this: talks are ongoing. They are difficult. Canadian negotiators have said clearly there remains a great deal of work left to do, and that gap has not closed as quickly as anyone would like this close to the deadline. Prime Minister Carney has staked out a position that Canada will not accept a bad deal, even under pressure. And provincial leaders, particularly in Quebec, have echoed that same resolve when it comes to protecting supply management. Whether that resolve holds, whether a framework acceptable to Washington actually emerges before Wednesday morning, or whether the 50% tariffs simply take effect as scheduled while negotiations continue in their shadow, is genuinely still an open question. Nobody has an answer yet, not in Ottawa, not in Washington, and certainly not in any headline claiming otherwise before the deadline has even arrived. What is certain is that this moment matters well beyond the specific goods on the tariff list. It is shaping how much Canada can rely on its largest trading partner going forward, how stable the broader continental trade framework really is now that CUSMA itself sits on a shorter, less certain leash, and how much leverage a country the size of Canada actually has when negotiating against an administration willing to use tariffs this aggressively as a tool of pressure. Those are the kinds of questions that will keep shaping this relationship long after this particular deadline. Whichever way it breaks has come and gone. There is another layer to this worth understanding, because it explains why the two sides keep circling back to the same handful of sticking points instead of finding a quick compromise. Trade negotiations like this one are never really about a single tariff rate. They are about years of accumulated grievance on both sides, and each side has its own version of the story. From the American side, officials point to the retaliation Canada rolled out after Trump's earlier tariffs, noting that Canada and China were, by their account, the only two economies that hit back at all when the broader wave of tariffs was first announced. That framing matters to Washington. It treats Canada's retaliation not as a defensive response, but as an act that singled the country out. And that perception has shaped how aggressively the administration has been willing to escalate since. From the Canadian side, the view is essentially the reverse. Ottawa maintains it had every right to respond after the United States raised barriers against Canadian exports first, arguing the retaliation was proportionate and necessary to defend Canadian workers and Canadian industries that were being squeezed. Both of those stories cannot be fully reconciled, and that is a large part of why a deal that looked achievable in principle keeps slipping through everyone's fingers in practice. It is also worth understanding just how quickly the tone of this relationship shifted. As recently as early 2025, the trading relationship between these two countries was frequently described using words like harmonious and nearly tariff-free, the kind of quiet, functional partnership businesses had built entire operations around for decades. Within about 18 months, that description flipped entirely. Tariffs went up, retaliation followed, talks broke down, restarted, and broke down again. And now here we are with a 50% tariff threat sitting days away and CUSMA itself hanging in a more precarious position than at any point since the original deal was signed. That is not a slow drift. That is a fast unraveling of a relationship long treated as one of the most predictable in the world. For everyday Canadians who are not directly employed in an affected industry, it can be tempting to treat all of this as background noise, a story for economists and trade lawyers to worry about. That would be a mistake. Tariffs at this scale tend to work their way through an economy in ways that eventually touch almost everyone, through the price of a car, through the cost of groceries that rely on cross-border supply chains, through the health of local economies built around manufacturing and export jobs in provinces like Ontario and Quebec in particular. Even people with no direct stake in dairy, alcohol, or auto manufacturing are likely to feel some version of the ripple effects if this standoff drags on much longer, or if it escalates into a fresh round of retaliation on both sides. So keep watching this space over the coming days, because very little about it is settled. Wednesday will bring one of a small number of outcomes, and each of them carries real consequences. There could be a last-minute framework that both governments can live with, one that shelves the new tariffs in exchange for the kind of concessions currently being discussed around autos, alcohol, and dairy quotas. There could be a partial deal that buys more time without fully resolving the underlying dispute. Or there could be no deal at all, in which case the 50% tariffs take effect as scheduled, and Canada moves ahead with its own promised response. Whichever path this takes, it will shape how Canada and the United States trade with each other for years to come. And it deserves to be watched with clear eyes rather than premature certainty about how the story ends.